In response to the militant Palestinian group Hamas's attack on Israel, Sweden and the EU are reviewing their non-humanitarian aid to Palestinians, while accusations are flying about a so-called double standard in the West's actions in the Middle East and Ukraine.
We shouldn't have any double standards. We should apply the same standards when it comes to atrocities committed.
My guest this week on Conflict Zone is Swedish Foreign Minister Tobias Billström. He joins me from Stockholm. As the bombardment of Gaza intensifies, how concerned is he that the conflict could spread in the region? And with the risk of attention being diverted, how can he continue to shore up support for the war in Ukraine? Foreign Minister Billström, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you very much.
There are fears that the Israel-Hamas war could widen into a broader Middle East conflict as Israel steps up its bombardment of Gaza and clashes at Israel's northern border with Lebanon intensify. How are you looking at the current situation?
Well, it is indeed a very, very horrible situation which is now evolving before our eyes. And I think that we have to look at this from both a short-term and a long-term perspective. The short-term perspective is, of course, that we need to bring more humanitarian assistance to Gaza. We need to acknowledge that Israel has the right to defend itself against the atrocities and the terrorist attacks by the terrorist organization Hamas and Islamic Jihad. But we also have to look to the suffering of the people in Gaza and to find a way to bring humanitarian assistance in the shape of water, supplies, food, and also fuel for the desalination plants inside of Gaza to get fresh water to the people in there is important. On the other hand, we also have to look at the very important issue of releasing the hostages taken by Hamas. And in this, I can see many actors playing an important role: the European Union, the United States, the UN, of course, but also the Arab states, who I think are acting in a very constructive way. I've done a reach out to colleagues in this regard, and that's my feeling.
The EU has increased its humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, but at the same time, you will be reviewing your non-humanitarian aid. What does that mean? Are you just now checking if you indirectly gave money to Hamas, which the EU, as you've mentioned there, classifies as a terrorist organization?
I think that under the circumstances, it is prudent to see to it that no money which is allocated to the Palestinian Authority finds its way into the pockets of organizations like Hamas or Islamic Jihad. But in the long term, this is also connected to the question of the peace process. We need to see to it that the Palestinian Authority can function and that it is a credible organization. Because if we are going for a two-state solution, and this has to be the long-term perspective to establish peace in the region, two states, Israel's and Palestine's being able to live side by side.
Are you thinking about whether you will, in fact, reduce non-humanitarian aid, for example, on the EU level? Because, I mean, the EU is the biggest single donor of aid to Palestinians.
Well, from an EU perspective, I don't see that happening. I think that it is important, and I think that there's a clear majority also in the Council in favor of this. I also think that we have to understand that, undermining the credibility of the Palestinian Authority would be a dangerous thing. That could actually help Hamas and Islamic Jihad to gain supporters in Palestine, in both the West Bank and Gaza, and that would be really dangerous.
When we look at the overall EU approach so far, what we have seen is disunity and confusion on display. First, there was a statement that the EU said it suspended its aid to Palestinians in response to the attack on Israel by Hamas. That statement was reversed soon thereafter. Isn't it a bit embarrassing in the middle of a crisis like this?
I think that we have to separate the issues. It is quite clear that that statement was premature, but that was done by an individual commissioner, not by the Commission itself. And when it comes to the member states, well, it is the member states who are calling the shots on this, and it is the member states also ultimately who decides this. And I have to say that I've just come back from yesterday's meeting in Luxembourg with the feeling that, yes, there are debates and discussions, quite naturally in a heated moment like this, But the EU has to maintain and achieve unity. Now we have an upcoming meeting with the leaders, the European Council now Wednesday, and that I think will bring some more clarity to this.
But you know what it does speak to, Mr. Foreign Minister, is how the EU expects to find consensus on the future of aid for Palestinians and just the general approach to the situation. I'd like to ask you about one aspect of that. How about, for example, calling for a ceasefire so that that crucial aid that you mentioned, the humanitarian aid, may be let into Gaza for those civilians? The UN is calling for it. EU foreign ministers couldn't agree at a meeting earlier this week. Where do you stand?
Well, we stand on the side of a High Representative, Josep Borrell, who has spoken about a humanitarian pause. I think that this is the way forward. We have to understand, again, that this is a very complex situation. There are no easy solutions to this, no quick fixes. But a humanitarian pause would enable us to bring the aid into Gaza, to the suffering people, in forms of food and water and medicine and also fuel. And I think this is important.
You spoke a little bit earlier about diplomacy and the prospect of a two-state solution. Sweden in general, back in 2014, was the first EU member in Western Europe to officially recognize a state of Palestine, saying, and I'm quoting here, "We hope this will show the way for others." You've been supporting Palestinians toward a two-state solution. Is there any hope of that anymore, realistically?
Yeah, well, the two-state solution has to be achieved because it is the only way, the only feasible way of bringing peace to this region, to the people who are suffering, to both Israelis and to Palestinians. And there are credible solutions on the table and have been for many, many years now. But what it boils down to is that you have to achieve trust and you have to achieve confidence enough among leaders. And one thing, though, that I take a bit of hope in, and I think one has to understand, of course, that during a moment like this, when the bombs are falling, it doesn't perhaps perhaps you don't feel like this. But actually, after every big crisis over the last 20 years, there has been a restart of the peace process and a way forward. And I think we have to understand that this could be the outcome of this terrible situation which we are facing right now. And frankly, the Swedish government don't really see an alternative to the two-state solution. So we're going to work in favor of this with partners, both in the Middle East, with the United States, with the UN and within the EU, of which we are a part.
Let's turn now to the impact inside the EU's borders. We are seeing heightened security concerns here in Europe over the situation in the Middle East. The EU Foreign Policy Chief, Josep Borrell, said last week that when he hears, and I'm quoting here, religious authorities speaking the language of inter-religious conflict and explicitly stating that Europe is a party to the conflict, he feels the storm clouds are looming. He says he believes we are on the edge of the abyss. Do you agree with him?
I think that he's onto something very important, namely that we have to find a balanced way forward. We have to acknowledge the indispensable right of Israel to defend itself against terrorist attacks. Frankly speaking, which government wouldn't do that when you're faced with the slaughtering of your own citizens in thousands, as has been the case on the 7th of October atrocities?
So European countries, they're increasing their security measures, including border checks as a result of the conflict and a series of violent attacks here, including 2 Swedish nationals killed in Brussels last week by a gunman claiming allegiance to the so-called Islamic State, presumably in response to a number of recent Quran burnings in Sweden this past year. Tell us a little bit more about the security situation and how it's affecting Sweden in particular.
Well, the terrorist deed was, of course, terrible, and we are, we're all in shock together with the people, the near and the dear, who suffered the loss of the lives of their family members. We also have to look, of course, to the security situation. You mentioned it, and I think we have to do this on many levels. The Swedish security police already during the summer raised the level of terrorist threat from 3 to a 4 on a 5 scale. And we actually were afraid that something like this, which happened in Belgium, could happen. But that mustn't deter us from continuing along the same path that we have already started to thwart, and that is to clamp down on terrorism. And we have to do this with the help of the police, but we also have to do it with the dialogue with people so that we can push back the terrorist threats and the levels which we see are rising now in our society.
But can you tell us a little bit more about how you're clamping down on the incidents that have caused so much anger? Because, you know, many in the Muslim world are furious about these public Quran burnings that have taken place in your country. And I'd just like to bring in the example in June, because there we understand that two men were watched by a crowd of people. They tore pages out of the Quran, they burned them outside of a mosque, and they were granted a permit for demonstration. That's how things work in your country. They didn't hide their intent to burn the book. And yet, the New York Times reported this, that the demonstrations were not allowed to burn objects in Stockholm. So how is it that these demonstrators were able to ultimately burn the book?
The reason is that the Swedish legislation is constructed in a way that we give permits for demonstrations. But as you said, quite rightly, they do not have a permit to burn the book, to burn holy scripture, the Quran or any other book. What the Swedish government is now doing is that we have launched an inquiry into the Public Order Act, which governs the police authorities' responsibility to grant permits. And that inquiry means that it will also lead to an opportunity to look into the possibility of bringing national security when you grant a permit, something which you cannot do today. And this is a tool which the government wants to know more about.
But Mr. Foreign Minister, your neighbor Denmark, for example, they're taking moves to actually outrightly ban Quran burnings following outrage over burnings there as well. Is it time for Sweden to think about doing the same?
The problem is that Denmark and Sweden have different legislations. If we were to do the thing which we are doing in Denmark, that would be a constitutional issue. It has to lead to constitutional changes in Sweden. While if Denmark were to do what we are planning to do, changing the Public Order Act, that would lead to constitutional changes in their legislation because they don't operate permits.
Russia has meantime been spreading narratives, especially in the developing world, saying that Sweden is hostile toward Islam. For example, the Kremlin-controlled outlets created a rumor that Swedish social services were systematically kidnapping and trying to Christianize children from Muslim families. That campaign is said to have reached hundreds of millions of followers on social media. How widespread is disinformation like this? How big is the problem for you?
It is a big problem, and we can see that states, both Russia, state actors, Russia and Iran is also another country, which has furthered this campaign and promoted it in social media channels. And it is a very, very aggressive campaign, and it aims both towards Muslims in other countries and Muslims in my own countries. We are now combating this. We have brought together the responsible authorities in Sweden all the way down to municipality level and all the way up to national authorities in order to hammer out a counter campaign to this. And we are well on this from the government side to do so. We're also going to do it together with partners. And we have to understand that this is the new information warfare operational arena which we are living through. This is the way things are going to be conducted, that you find things, small grains of truth, and then you blow them up. It's an old Russian trick, but you have to work against it.
Let's turn now to the war in Ukraine. How worried are you that attention and weapons will be diverted elsewhere given the conflict in the Middle East? For example, we've seen the U.S. Saying last week that tens of thousands of artillery shells promised to Ukraine are now going to be diverted to Israel. A sign of more to come?
You know, I'm quite confident in the words of President Biden when he was interviewed the other day and said, you know, we are the United States. Of course, we are capable of handling two conflicts at the same time. And I'm quite confident that this will be the case. And also, the conflict in Israel is not the conflict in Ukraine. It is not only in a much, much smaller scale, it is also different in its entire makeup. The war in Ukraine is a large-scale war, something we haven't seen in Europe since the Second World War. So we have to look at it from that point of view. But as I said, we're quite confident in the words of President Biden.
But where do you get that confidence, Mr. Foreign Minister? Because, I mean, it's quite clear that the U.S. president doesn't always have his Congress behind him. We've also been seeing divisions in the EU over Russia. They have been taken to the next level, in fact, after Hungary's Orban met with Putin. We've also seen the election of Robert Fico in Slovakia, who ran on an anti-Ukraine platform, basically showing how quickly the tide can turn, especially considering that Slovakia was the first country to deliver fighter jets to Ukraine. Aren't you concerned about EU unity and support for Ukraine? I mean, this seems like a clear sign of waning European support.
President Biden is clearly contemplating a package to be brought to Congress consisting of aid to both Ukraine, Israel and Taiwan in the same combination. I think that needs to be brought into the scope to understand the political realities. And we feel confident about this. Looking then to the EU, well, during the recent Swedish EU presidency during the spring, we were able to bring forward 2 new sanction packages against Russia. And I think that we are able to maintain unity and move forward. And I'm not worried about this, but we have to constantly contemplate it and not taking it for granted. That needs to be said. And above all, we have to give acknowledgement to the huge effort by the American people. I've said this publicly and I'll say it again. The fact that the US has provided so much military support to Ukraine is the reason why Ukraine is still standing as a state. The EU has done a lot when it comes to financial support to Ukraine, budgetary support, but we need to do more when it comes to military support and acknowledge what the US people are doing for Ukraine.
Experts say that one of the few weapon systems that could change the course of the war is fighter jets. Sweden says that it will only provide its Gripen warplanes to Ukraine if it gets NATO accession. Is there no chance of you providing these warplanes beforehand?
Well, I was present at the press conference at Hapsund, the Prime Minister's summer residence, when President Zelensky visited us earlier this autumn. And what the Prime Minister said then, it still stands, namely that we have to see to it that our NATO accession process is finalized. But we are already now training Ukrainian fighter jet pilots.
How quickly could you get Ukraine the planes if you are indeed admitted to NATO?
Well, I'm not going to talk about that because that is, of course, military secrets. But what I could say clearly is that once we have become NATO members, things will be in a different light. But we have to look to our own security first. That is, of course, imminent and imperative.
Another security threat, recent attacks on underseas infrastructure, this time a communication cable between Sweden and Estonia in the Baltic Sea, a gas pipeline connecting Finland and Estonia also damaged. Your Prime Minister has warned that these undersea data cables are both essential to the modern economy and vulnerable to attack. How vulnerable are you?
Well, it's not just us. Actually, we have to look at this again from an EU and from a NATO perspective. I mean, we have a neighboring country, Norway, who has gas fields and oil fields where you can see where the underwater cables are essential to the economy. And I think that we have to understand that this is also a new type of time which we are living in. The attitude of my government is that we need more cooperation with our neighbors, more cooperation with our NATO allies in order to counter this, and that calls, of course, for more I should say, capabilities when it comes to surveying situations underwater. And luckily, Sweden has good capabilities already, but we also would like to see more cooperation on this, because this is not something which is going away. We can see that this could be a very dangerous tools for adversaries to use against countries like Sweden, Estonia, and Finland in this case.
And Finland's foreign minister said the 2 undersea links have probably been damaged on purpose. Do you agree? Is it likely sabotage? Who's behind it, Russia?
Well, again, I need to say that I'm not going to attribute this to any country right now. There is a police investigation underway. When that is finalized and the prosecutor has said what they need to say, I might be able to do a public statement on this. But before that, I'm not going to do it. I think that would be wrong of me as a minister to do so.
Let's talk about your membership in NATO, which has long been blocked by Turkey. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has just submitted a bill approving your membership bid to his parliament for ratification. In general, though, how disappointed are you in the process and the demands that Turkey has been placing on you?
I've said it many times before, and I'll say it again, that the memorandum signed in Madrid at the summit in Madrid last year was important because it meant that Sweden undertook certain responsibilities for changes that were legitimate on behalf of Turkey. And those changes have been conducted. That means that we now combat the organization PKK's activities in my country in a more coherent way, taking measures which have led to people being handed verdicts in our courts. For example, a man was handed a verdict just 2 weeks ago, a 4.5-year sentence for armed robbery, with a clear connection of getting money to send to the PKK. Now, the PKK doesn't conduct terrorist operations as such on directed against Sweden on our territory, but they collect money which they use for terrorist activities against Turkey. So Turkey have had legitimate claims, but the summit in Vilnius this summer meant that Turkey acknowledged that Sweden had fulfilled our part of the bargain, and that means also that the start of the ratification process now underway in the Turkish parliament is a firm sign of this.
But, you know, I mean, there was the recent comment, though, however, from the Turkish vice president saying that we don't see a satisfactory level of implementation when we talk about those measures that you have taken. We have also seen Erdogan, make a request from the United States, including the U.S. selling F-16 fighter jets to Turkey as a precondition to your accession. You know, you've already taken all these measures that you've highlighted there. When is it just too much for Sweden? What are your red lines?
Well, first of all, this is a fundamental change of Swedish foreign and security policy, the largest one in 200 years. We have been a non-military aligned country for 2 centuries. So, of course, a question of a few months doesn't mean very much in that perspective. And we are not disappointed at all. On the contrary, yesterday's news were, of course, a source of joy. But we aren't through yet. We need to see the full ratification process happening in Turkey, and then, of course, also in Hungary. And
yeah, let's talk more about Hungary, because they must also sign off. There, the foreign minister has written you a very pointed letter asking you to stop your politicians and press from criticizing Hungary's democracy. Otherwise, it won't ratify your accession. The Hungarians even uploaded that letter to Twitter. And of course, they know that you can't control what opposition politicians or press might be saying because of freedom of speech laws. So what do you think is at play here? The Hungarian government just looking for excuses to feel insulted? And how concerning is this?
I think that the the Hungarian parliament has been very clear on the matter, saying that we won't be the last to ratify Sweden. That has been repeated both by Prime Minister Viktor Orban and also by my foreign minister colleague. And that means that Hungary has already committed itself. Once the process in Turkey is underway, as it is now, we expect ratification to start in the Hungarian parliament as well. And they only have the final vote left. They've already done the committee work in the parliament. And also, just on that same line, there is a difference also between Turkey and Hungary. With Turkey, we have had a clear stakes. With Hungary, never asked for anything like that when they accepted that Sweden were given the status as the invitee at last year's summit in Madrid. So I think that the Hungarian parliament should move on with the ratification, and that is the clear position of the Swedish government.
Some, especially in the global south, are looking at the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East as an approach that is laced with double standards. One analyst saying there's a perception that the West cares more about Ukrainian refugees, about Ukrainian civilian suffering than suffering in Yemen, in Gaza, in Sudan, and Syria. The former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt has said the following: this is something that we must deal with. First of all, do you even recognize that there could be a double standard at play, and how do you deal with it?
Well, we have been very clear from our path, especially in my statement, which I delivered at the United Nations General Assembly, where I said very clearly that we need to take into account that the Ukrainian conflict is something which, is of importance to all the world. Because it means that if Ukraine were to lose, the rules-based world order and the UN Charter would be gone. And those are principles which means a lot to our global partners, wherever they are in the world. And this is a good platform to stand on. But I do acknowledge what you say. We have we shouldn't have any double standards. We should apply the same standards when it comes to atrocities committed. And we should also that means that the humanitarian problems which we now see in Gaza needs to be solved in order for this to be, a credible policy operated by the EU.
Some diplomats are warning that the West is losing the global South. What is the danger here if this situation is not handled well by the EU, if the South does not perceive that the West is handling the situation well and equitably?
Well, that could be, that definitely could be a threat, but I think that we are doing the right thing right now. We're both seeking a reach out to the Arab world in looking for solutions, both to the hostage crisis in relation to the terrorist organization Hamas, and also the question of a humanitarian pause when it comes to Gaza, and ultimately the two-state solution, which needs to be brought forward. Only by operating on all these levels at the same time can we maintain credibility on the global level.
Foreign Minister Billström, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on Conflict Zone. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.